Hey guys, welcome back to another class. Today's class is going to be about OPing. It's going to be an OPing guide for beginners. I'm going to be covering some of the essentials that you need to know before you start your OPing journey. I feel like today's class is going to be a little bit longer, so if you do want to have a chance to kind of focus on what you want to learn, there's going to be a huge timestamp guide down below, so you can kind of just cover whatever you need. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get started. Today's class is going to cover 3 different topics. The first one is just going to cover the basics, and this is where the majority of our time is going to be spent. Then after that, I'm going to be giving you some of the tricks that you can use to sort of start getting better between like different types of plays that you can make and the like. And last but not least, I'm going to just kind of end it with some tips that you should know, some things that you should kind of learn. For example, some tech. And last but not least, something that you could just implement in your games if you want to be more aggressive. But with that out of the way, let's get started. With everything that I've done so far, I'm pretty sure you guys already kind of see this coming, right? I'm taking in more students. So far, we've been seeing the same trend. A student will see some sort of success between the first 3 weeks, right? So if you're kind of interested in that, don't be afraid to join the Discord and just sort of DM me or just ping me in the channel. I'm always down for that. So with the class itself, let's talk about the basics of an opper, okay? In order for you to kind of pick up the op, you need to understand it. So the first few things that you need to know is that in terms of base speed, when you pick up an op, you are going to just be slow. You have a slower movement speed whenever you're kind of walking with it, and you're going to be even slower when you're ADSing with it. So whenever you're scoped down, you're already going to be moving way slower than what you would with a rifle. So with that out of the way, right, like you need to make sure that you're aware of your movement speed and your positioning, as you can be easily punished for it. It's also a one-shot kill. Anything that is above the waist is going to result in a kill. So whenever you're looking for any sort of like fights, you got to make sure that your crosshair placement is properly aligned. The next few things are pretty straightforward. It's an expensive gun, but it also has high penetration because it is a sniper. So if you have any sort of chances to sort of play around it, I mean, you're always going to be able to do things like, for example, in this position, let's say someone is going to turn around the corner. I can very easily just headshot them or hit them through the box, and that's going to do a lot of damage. Okay. And when it comes to the angles and the perspective that you have with an op, it's going to be different from that of a rifle. So you can go for slightly tighter corners and slightly tighter angles that you wouldn't necessarily use with something like a rifle, but you can do what the pros do, where they just kind of look at their screen, and the second a pixel changes, they just press fire, and that's kind of how they work around it. So you can kind of see what I'm kind of getting at here. The angles are going to be a lot different when you're playing with an op. However, that doesn't mean that whatever you know from a rifle is not going to transfer over. There's going to be things that you should know about it when you're getting into the op. But again, if anything, you're going to be picking up anything from this, you should be aware of the hitbox and where you should be shooting. You should be looking for around sort of like the middle of the waist, on the top of the chest. That's normally where most of your shots should be hitting. So even if you're someone that doesn't hit the head all the time, you should be able to easily confirm kills with the op. Now let's talk about lanes and lines. So in order for you to be able to play the op, you need to understand what you're sort of trying to do and what your objective is going to be. Every single site has its own linear path that sort of leads into that site. Or for example, mid has its own paths that lead towards mid. And this is what a lane is. So let's say, for example, you're playing something like Cypher. You can maybe, for example, just play towards B site, but a lot of the times you're going to be losing a lot of space towards B because you have no B control, you have no B lane control, right? So this is kind of how you would sort of interpret what exactly the mains are and what they do. And when you're looking at these lanes as an op, you're going to be working to getting control for one of these lanes. And this is where the next part comes in. So lanes are pretty straightforward, right? In order for you to have control of a site, you need to have control of the lane. So how can you do that with an op? With an op, you have to control lines. Now, lines as an opper are pretty much directed to how you are essentially holding a lot of the space between you and the angle, and how you are kind of holding it with the line of sight, okay? But as an opper, most of your time is going to be spent as a defender, right? As the movement speed of the op is not going to be very beneficial. So when we're fighting for all of this space, you're most of the time going to be finding yourself as an opper on defense. This doesn't mean that it is impossible to play attack op. It is just more of a nuisance than it is beneficial, and you're probably going to be more punished than anything, okay? So we're going to be looking at a lot of different ways to really lock down these lanes. So back to lines. When we're looking at lines and we're looking at the angles that you're holding, you're going to see from this little chart right here, you can see how this kind of ties into the line. This perspective that I have right now, this area that I'm holding with my crosshair, this is the line that I'm currently going to have. If you watch pro play, you're going to notice that a lot of the times the perspective of the observers will have like these lines. Those are what lines are. Essentially, the line of sight that you have on something, that is the line you're going to hold. As an opper, it is very important for you to hold these lines and for you to hold them according to what you're trying to do. And depending on what you're trying to fight or what you're trying to hold, you might have to find some instances of you maybe having to hold close or far. So here is a little guide in case you sort of need to work with it. If you're looking for anybody that's, for example, jiggling, let's say, for example, they're coming in over here where I have on my cursor, they're coming in close, they're just jiggling, maybe they're jumping, maybe they're doing a short swing to kind of clear this area. Whenever you're expecting this type of fight, you should be tucking in a little bit closer to the angle that you're playing with, maybe next to a wall so you have more cover, and hold a tighter angle for that area. Make sure that it's not too small, as you still want to give some leeway for the person to swing out, right? And then that's it. You hold closer to the wall when you're trying to do that. However, if you're trying to catch opponents off guard, maybe you want to have an off angle, maybe you want to catch them when they're doing longer swings. So for example, they're holding close and they want to swing longer, then you want to make sure that you're holding farther away from the wall. Don't be too concerned necessarily about how long they're going to be swinging. More often than not, you can just hold for the jiggle and you'll still be able to catch the cross and the long swing. Okay. Whenever you're paying attention to your crosshair placement, it should be waist or chest level. So make sure that, you kind of pay attention to where the head is. Normally you want to aim a little bit lower to what you're used to. So if you feel like you're aiming too high, I feel like you should trust your gut on that one and just aim a little bit lower, as you just need to hit somewhere around the waist and you'll still be fine. This is a tip that you can kind of follow, but you can crouch if you need to. Some agents do benefit directly from just having, a smaller hitbox against the opponent. But again, you're going to be sort of sitting down when you already have an immobile weapon, so you can use that to your own discretion, right? Last but not least, and this is something that I kind of have to show, you're going to notice by this line that I have right here that it not only covers close when it is a close angle right here, but it also covers a far angle when someone is farther away. So as you can see from this angle right here, I'm also fighting someone that would be fighting towards the box, right? Or maybe, for example, right here, I'd fight someone that's fighting towards the box. Depending on what the angle that you're trying to hold is, you might have to sort of adjust for it. And this is where experience kind of comes in. And obviously, you need to pick up the op in order for you to see these things happening all at once. The next thing that you guys need to sort of understand is, what is a power position? A power position is something that gives an op more control just by existing. You can sort of hold any lane you want with the op, but there are positions that are more impactful than others. And over time, you're going to notice which ones they are. There could be a lot of OPing guides and a lot of map guides, but over time, you will sort of develop a sense for where these positions are. But here's some sort of the guidelines that you can use to sort of identify them. If you can get good information down the lane that you're sort of covering, if you can get easy kills if they're contesting, then you have a good power position. If the enemy has to invest a lot of maybe, for example, utility, or maybe they have to invest maybe, for example, some sort of ult, then you're doing something right. Let's say, for example, when playing over here in Icebox and I'm on top of this generator, maybe they have to send a drone, perhaps double swing, perhaps a dart, right? Maybe something, for example, they have to fight back with some other piece of utility, right? This is how you're going to be aware that this is a powerful position. However, power positions always have the cost of being contested, and because they have the position of being contested, you're always going to be threatened. So a power position is something that they're going to try to take away from you, and this is where you have to make sure that you are pretty good at getting that first shot down, as you need to get that kill. Last few things to kind of note is that a power position is really good at locking down areas, and it gives your team a positional advantage on defense. So think of the amount of times that you've stacked the site because you've let your Cypher sort of hold a site on their own and they're solo holding. It sort of works in a similar fashion as you're sort of locking down a lane, you're getting information and you're getting a decent idea as to what they're going to do. And this allows you to sort of lock down an area as your team stacks other positions. So for example, in this area over here by split, I'm able to hold down this lane, and the team is able to hold maybe 2 for A and 2 for B, depending on what's going on. And this allows the team to sort of hold more space, right? So using that in mind, you're able to sort of control more space and give your team more chances to win, as you are basically doing your job of holding space and they're going to do theirs, okay? Moving on to more things. This is where the general tips kind of come in, and more of the tricks that you sort of will pick up as more experience kind of comes in. Obviously, I can tell you to sort of be patient with your shot. They're not going to kill you immediately, right? But with that out of the way, there's obviously things that you should know about the way you should reposition and sort of play the game. When you're playing every single round, unless they're sort of contesting you, unless they have some sort of concuss, a flash, a drone, unless they're using a lot of utility to flush you out, there's really no reason for you to sort of be kind of scared of the position that you're going to be playing, right? So unless you have strategy or something like that, unless you're expected to sort of hold A on your own in this position on Haven and the team is going to be playing towards B and C, right? Unless there's a plan in mind, most of the time you're okay with taking the initial fight and then just leaving. You should always reposition, whether you take the first shot or whether you even just get contested. Let's say you get stunned in this position or you get flashed. There is no reason for you to come back, right? After a kill, let's say you get this neon in this position, right? There's no reason for you to sort of re-peek. There's always a chance for you to reposition. And this is where the first tip comes in. Make sure you're changing it up, whether it's at the beginning of every round or after getting an initial pick, because this creates question marks. It creates anxiety because the next fight or the next angle that they peek, you might be there. And this is why it is very useful to sort of change it up every single time, as it can make it a lot harder for people in ranked to sort of identify your position. So a good example of this might be using the idea of a question mark. And if you're not really familiar to what a question mark is, it's pretty much where you have no idea where they're going to be. So therefore, there's sort of like a question of their position, right? So let's take this idea, for a spin so you can kind of get an idea of how this works. Let's say I get this neon down. Now I have the option to either retreat to back site and maybe use this to kind of get them again in case they try to swing me out long, or I can potentially move towards short if they slow down and there's nothing going on. Maybe my breach decides to stun them down over here in long and I just peek short and I catch them again. Constantly repositioning will always get me a new fight, and as an opper, you want to make sure that you're staying as oppressive as possible. Because if you are not as oppressive and you're basically getting them to push you in, then you're pretty much losing your job, okay? Make sure you're paying attention to how much utility you're baiting out of them. Make sure you're paying attention to how much you're actually getting them to be scared and they're not being as aggressive against you, right? Make sure you're paying attention to that, as it is very useful. Okay, and as I mentioned here, even when you get the first kill, by not coming back and not re-peeking and repositioning, you can actually bait out more utility, as they have to ensure that you're no longer there. Okay, so this is actually one of the first tips that you should know. Make sure you're sort of changing your positioning after a kill or after every single round. Other things that you can look at are basically how people look at pixel angles. I know that some people come from games like Rainbow Six Siege, and they sort of believe that there's these pixel angles that they can hold, that only they can hold, and that's what makes them really useful. In fact, that's actually kind of the opposite. The less leeway you have with an op shot, the less beneficial it's going to be for you and your team. You want to make sure that you still have a decent distance between you and the shot. For example, in this position, if I decided to hold a little bit tighter, I would not be able to guarantee the shot. So just because you have a crazy pixel angle does not mean that it's going to be beneficial for anybody. If the whole point is for you to watch the cross, you don't really need an op, right? You still need to guarantee a kill. You still want to stay oppressive. And if you're not giving yourself that chance to take the shot, you're not going to be very useful. Okay? And the second thing is, if you are in this position where you're noticing that you are still in a very powerful area, or you took out someone that could potentially make your life hell. So for example, let's say that you took out the neon that was being a problem and you weren't able to take this space and hold it before, which is why you were repositioning. In this position, if you took out someone that was problematic, you can ask for utility to re-peek the angle. Now, of course, it's ranked and you can ignore this advice and just sort of peek it again if you're feeling it. But the best and most guaranteed way of you retaking this space is by just using utility. This happens everywhere in either pros or even tier 2, right? This is exactly what you see. They'll ask for something like a drone, maybe they'll ask for a flash, maybe a smoke of some way, like a one-way. They'll ask for something that will allow them to control this space again. If you're not someone that likes to ask for that utility, then by no means is that a problem. You still have the option of repositioning like we talked about. Let's talk a little bit about buying. I feel like this is where I find a lot of oppers getting stuck. They don't really know when to buy, and when they do get a chance to buy, they get scared. There's a couple of ways that you can sort of figure out your buying strategy. The one that I teach the most is basically getting the op as fast as possible. And this is the one where, number one, you have to get really used to playing a little bit more frugal and at the same time a little bit less equipped for fights, but it is going to be more rewarding down the line. Let me give you an example. In route 1, what you can do is, let's say you win pistol round. What a lot of players tend to do is on second round, they buy, I don't know, maybe they buy a Stinger, maybe they buy a Spectre, maybe they buy a Bulldog, right? They buy something that's going to guarantee them the third round onward, right? They want to make sure that they're still staying in the fight despite the fact that they're not going to be really having much of a contest on round 2. But what you will see on round 2, something that you can try to do is just try to maintain your pistol. So let's say someone upgrades to a Spectre and they still have a Ghost. What you can do instead is buy minimal utility and maybe a half shield if possible, and just learn to play around that idea. And then once you jump into third round, you should have enough credits to buy that op, right? So there's a lot of different ways that people might do it. They might still have half shield. They might be able to buy full shield depending on how expensive the character is or how much they used in terms of a character, right? Like maybe they used all of their smokes if they were playing Jet, right? So there's some things that you kind of have to play around with when you're kind of like using this strategy, but this is one of the fastest. One of the things that I see a lot of people do is that they'll follow this route and then by the third round they'll chicken out because they rather do it on fourth round and now they're kind of useless on third, and they could have been a lot more effective and maybe gotten some ult points on round 2 by getting kills. Don't chicken out. If you're going to be opping by round 3 and you're preparing to op by round 3, then so be it. If you want to save your money for round 4, just keep that in mind that you could have done something else if you wanted to keep it by round 4. But this is the fastest strategy. Obviously, the other strategy would be pretty simple. Make sure you're winning multiple rounds. Make sure your team is staying alive. Make sure that you're staying wealthy, right? That's a pretty straightforward strategy that a lot of people like to do. However, what happens when you guys are pretty much just trading rounds, right? This is where you kind of have to look at the more frugal way of kind of gaining utility out and kind of gaining money. And one of the more popular ones that I've seen a lot of people do is they actually learn to play with half shield, or they're pretty much learning to kind of ask for guns and sort of keeping the money sort of steady. So over time, after 2 or 3 rounds, depending on how many times they're getting kills or winning, right, you can still get a chance to buy an op pretty quickly. Over time, you'll kind of start to see that only 2 rounds are necessary to really get to that position. But over time, you'll kind of also notice that it doesn't really quite matter who buys the op as long as you're able to trade that in return. So trade guns, ask for people for their secondaries like I mentioned on that round 2. Look for stuff like that. Maybe learn to play with half shield so you can sort of get that money for the next round to be able to buy that op. If you buy the op and you don't have a shield, don't worry. A lot of the times people think that that's not really good. But in reality, if you miss that shot, that's not really going to make a difference. It might give you some leeway if you do miss. But at the end of the day, you're trying to not miss. Okay. Moving on. When you're playing as an opper, you got to make sure that you're planning ahead. And one of the easiest ways to plan ahead, it's going to be to very simply just choose an agent that is capable of opping. Obviously, you can do what everybody does and is just op for the sake of it. You can also do what a lot of tier 2 teams do, where they just put other characters on different op positions. We've seen Sentinels do it. We've seen, not the team, like the actual role, Sentinels play it. I've seen a lot of controllers play it as well. Even when Pearl was a thing, right? Like bringing back Pearl, since Pearl is going to be coming back, they would give it to Viper, and then Viper would like to hold down a lane, right? It's still possible in other characters, and we will talk about that. But if you're going to be investing into the op, consider the 2 characters that are meant to do it, and that is Chamber and Jet. There's no preference as to which one you're going to be picking. I think that in terms of what you're going to be doing with either, you have to still be proficient at their occasional, role of being an opper, but you should still be able to master the fact that as a Jett, you still have to entry occasionally. Staying on op on defense, it's not going to be your only way to win, right? You still have to be an effective attacker. And then when you're playing something like Chamber, you got to make sure that you have decent lurks and you're able to play around his kit, as not a lot of people are able to use the Deagle, right? So as long as you keep that in mind, you'll be fine. Both of them have pros and both of them are have a lot of cons. I would say that if you're someone that's just getting started and want to kind of get a mix of everything, I feel like Jett is the easiest to kind of pick up. Chamber is still really good to play. However, due to the fact that you sort of have to get used to really good anchor spots and you have to sort of master the aim with everything else in his kit, you're probably better off picking the Jett. When you're looking at everything else, however, you got to remember that both of these two have really good things in common, and that is that their kits allow them to play way more aggressive and allow them to play for riskier, more off-angle plays that other characters really can't do as an op. So make sure that you're using these to the fullest in order for you to get the full benefit out of the characters. When we're looking at other agents, these ones will feel like hot takes, and I will admit that. However, it is still possible to play these two. You can add other characters such as Neon and potentially even Race into the mix. But the reason I picked these two are for very similar reasons as the ones that I picked before. Both of them have something in their kit that can bail them out. Normally, it is a form of repositioning. And when we look at the way that you can play an op without an op character, these two will make a little bit more sense. But in general, these two are really good at either getting some sort of advantage by either finding off angles that they can get themselves out of. So for example, let's say you're playing Ascent, you can get into wine really quickly with something like Yoru and then just bail out without having to use something like Chamber or Jett. Or maybe you're playing something like Haven and you pick something like maybe, for example, Omen. You can start up high and catch someone off guard in case you have maybe, for example, a Neon and you want to hold down a lane. Right? So they have their advantages. They're not just like one tricks in that regard, but they do have some limitations. So for example, you want to be using your flashes on Yoru and it might be a little difficult to balance that. Whereas Omen, balancing, holding an angle and at the same time throwing smokes might throw you off. So balancing between those two might be difficult. But again, it's something to kind of consider. Neon has a lot of mobility, so in case you don't want to just jump peek around the corner, you will always have the ability to sort of be able to see what's around that area before you peek it. So that's also an advantage. And then Race has satchels that she can use in case she needs to really quickly jump between one spot and the next. Again, depending on the character, there's still some things that can be used, but that's not necessarily our focus. I still want you guys to be aware that you should be picking Jett or Chamber if you're going to be investing in that, but there's no issue if you decide to opt with characters like these two. Let's talk a little bit more about the advanced tips, and this is where the whole idea of you not using an op with an opping character might come in, and this is where the tech part of things come in. It's not necessarily like a crazy tech tip, but I feel like some people might actually not know this, and I think it's important. Okay, if your angle is good, you can actually retreat without actually burning utility. And this is really common with Jetts that really just like to hold this angle, for example, and the first thing they would do is just dash away, right? This was very common for players like, for example, Chamber that would be holding this angle and immediately just TP away, using his TP that he could have used somewhere else. Both of these things were sort of picked up around the time that both of the characters didn't necessarily need it. So for example, when Chamber had his two anchors, right, they would still do it when it was unnecessary. And then when Jett still has the dash without like the activation, they would still do it, right? So the way that the tech tip would work is simply when you shoot your shot, you have basically a little bit of an animation cancel. The second the shot goes off, you can switch to your pistol or your knife, depending what it is that you're trying to get out of. I recommend the knife, but in between pressing 1, 2, and 3, I mean, it all kind of feels the same depending on how you press for your knife or when you press for your secondary. It doesn't really matter. Both of them offer a slight movement advantage that allows you to get out quicker. Okay. And when you're playing with a character that may or may not be able to op, or maybe you're playing with Jett and you don't want to use your dash all too quickly. Maybe, for example, you want to take a fight right here. This fight is, in favor of that of the op, that they don't really need to use dash, right? Being able to learn to just immediately cancel after taking your shot into a knife to be able to quickly transition between another position is really good. This allows you to stay moving, to stay on the flow of being able to move from one position to the next. And this is a really good way to stay in the fight because, again, when you're playing something like Jett, you need to stay on the move, you need to find fights. But when you're playing the op, they are very slow, right? The op is going to slow you down. So being able to transition between that is really good. This is not a really hard thing to kind of pick up, but some people might miss it, as they might just take the shot and then just kind of load the next round and then go back in. This is a really good way to stay on the move. So if you're someone that hasn't learned this, I suggest you learn it now. Implementing that idea in mind, you're actually able to use it with characters without an op, because after all, you still want to be able to transition between one area and the next. Being able to pick these tight angles and being able to use them to your advantage are always going to be around natural cover. So these walls are pretty good. Maybe, for example, truck is another example over here on bind. And what you're going to be doing is, in order for you to gain the same advantage as ops, you need to make sure that you're moving between cover to cover. You can't just pick an off angle, like for example, from here all the way to the right and just have this off angle that you can catch someone off guard with, right? You can't really do that with these agents. And the only way that you're able to gain that advantage is by moving from cover to cover. This might feel tedious at first, and you might feel that you're just better off holding the off angle anyway. You might get the kill, but you want to make sure that you can guarantee the fight and also your life, because it might not be the only person around that corner and you might get traded. The process works as follows. Basically, you want to make sure that you find these angles that you can transition from, to and from. So for example, in the position of picking long over by B site, you might not exactly have this to your advantage. So it might be a little bit harder. You can't really transition from one point to the next. Whereas here you can transition from point 1 to point 2, maybe even point 3 to point 4 in case you want to hold that, 2.5. You're going to notice that this is a lot easier on something like showers, whereas something like long on B side for bind is not going to be as effective. Make sure you're finding natural cover to transition from, and when you're doing it, make sure you're constantly walking as you're moving and holding the angle. Do not put down your gun, do not put it away, do not pull out your knife as you transition from one point in the next. It is not worth it, as you're in an area that is quite dangerous and you want to make sure that you don't get punished. After all, you're not chamber or jet in that position. Okay, so as long as you're doing that, you're going to be fine. The stopping power is going to be just enough that if they do catch you off guard and you actually manage to just stop walking and take the shot, you're going to be able to win the fight if they shoot the body and they panic, which happens more often than you'd like to admit. Okay, so with that out of the way, try to use this strategy when fighting against maybe, for example, long angles and you're someone that's not really an op agent, but you want to hold an op just in case. After all, the ELO cannon is very powerful. Okay, last but not least, I felt kind of compelled to add this portion to it. I don't feel like it's ultra necessary for you to know this, but I feel like a lot of people tend to mess this up. And I feel like it's also a necessary tool for you to be aware of. Jump peeking is really, really good at catching people off guard. The main thing about jump peeking is that you can't really catch the opponent in the air. And by the time that you kind of realize that the opponent is right there and their shot is fully accurate, they're already on your screen, crouched and ready to go, right? So the way that jump peeking works is simple. You're basically peeking around an angle and just taking the shot. This can be dangerous, as a lot of players tend to just believe that you just take the fight and challenge it. There needs to be some information before you take the fight. Just randomly just peeking the area without any sort of information prior will cause you to die. And this happens a lot more often in lower elos than high elos, as there's a lot of differences between where a player might be to where you expect them to be. Not to mention your teammates are also in that same boat. So the way that I would recommend it is slowly peek areas. For example, like right here, you would peek this area over here so you don't get exposed to it. Maybe you'd just jump a little bit and kind of clear that, right? And then once you're ready to peek into this left area by window, you can just fully go ahead and take the jump. Make sure that you're being methodical when you're taking this jump. After all, you want to make sure that you're guaranteeing the fight and you're not just jumping into multiple opponents. Okay, jump peeking is pretty simple. Try not to get impatient. By the time that they realize that you're on their screen, you're already on the floor, crouched and ready to shoot. So don't get impatient and think that you need to shoot it while you're in the air. Don't think that you need to shoot when you see them on your screen. You actually have more time than you think. And this is where both the tech that I showed you and this kind of come in. You need to get some experience and try to practice that if possible. So we're pretty much done. The class felt a little bit I would say longer. I would feel like this is one of the longer classes, but I do appreciate everyone for kind of sitting down and just kind of looking at the guide and sort of kind of getting just a quick idea of how OPing works. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments or just ping me in the Discord channel. We're going to be opening the question period for the class here. Thank you guys for watching.